Hi everybody, welcome to the ELNET briefing. I should say good morning, good afternoon or good evening, wherever you might be. It's a little while since I've actually addressed you on the briefing, so it's really great to see everybody. We've got a fantastic speaker today and I'll introduce him in a moment. I just wanted to tell you a few words about the UK. I know how difficult things are in the States. Well, they're very difficult here too, and politically it's been very problematic in recent times. You will know of some of the actions of the Labour government that we've had to contend with. Started with restoring the funding to UNRWA, moved on to agreeing to support the ICC and the ICJ in acknowledging attesting that their inquiries were valid, which we do not accept. Moved on to something even worse, 30 arms licences suspended, in effect an embargo. Then not allowing serving IDF to attend the Royal College of Defence or the DESI show. And of course then the absolute worst part of this recognition of the state of Palestine was in following the French was posed. Things have changed a little bit, I'm glad to say. I think some of it is because of the work that we do in constantly meeting members of Parliament, particularly the Labour members of Parliament. As Labour forms the government, they have a huge majority and they don't have to have a general election until 2029. So the work we do with them is crucially important. Despite that list, we can't rule out or walk away from working with them. Since the Heaton Park synagogue attack, where 2 members of the community were killed, I think it's come home to people that anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in this country is life-threatening for the Jewish community. We've seen a huge spike in anti-Semitism, so the work that we're doing has never been more critical, and that anti-Semitism is directly related to the latest iteration of that hatred, anti-Zionism. It's been a little easier since the ceasefire, and that means there's many more MPs willing to sit down with us face to face, even if we can't get them in a room as a group, even when we have difficulty getting them on a delegation. Some of them will come, but the rest are those who we need to talk to. We know there is a large number of Labour MPs who are not sympathetic and don't want to meet with us and are very difficult. But there's also a reasonably large group who just keep their heads down, and there are consequences to silence. And we need to talk to them. And we found a little bit more of an open door since the ceasefire. And believe you me, we are walking through that door very quickly. We cannot just look the other way. We can't stand still. If we're not organising delegations, dialogues, meetings, and face-to-face meetings constantly, then things will get worse, not better. This is the British government, it's the UK government. We have to be active all the time. So in my view, although it might look to the outside like what on earth is going on in the UK, it might look like, why are we bothering with them? I think this is the most critical time when times are difficult. This brings me, talking about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, to our speaker for today. And the content of today's discussion is going to be about this book, Never, 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 Never Again. And this subheading, How the West Betrayed the Jews and Itself. I want to tell you a little bit about our speaker first. Jake, you're so very welcome. Jake has actually been to Israel with us. I know he's been many times, but he came on an ELNET delegation. And it was great to have you with us, Jake. I was interested in what you thought of it. Jake is a columnist at national newspapers, a broadcaster, a foreign correspondent. He was formerly editor also of the Jewish Chronicle. He has a very well-attended, very well-known podcast called The Brink, and he does this with the analyst Andrew Fox, a former parachute regiment officer, and you'll recall we've had Andrew on the programme as well. His last book before this one was called Israelophobia, and many now say it was a prophetic book because it was published, I think, exactly a month before 7th of October 2023, and it became the Daily Telegraph Book of the Year. Jake's reported from all over the world for Fleet Street Press and has presented numerous documentaries for the BBC and appears regularly on things like Radio 4 from our own correspondent. Jake, a brilliant CV. We're really pleased to have you with us today. Let me start by talking about this tour de force. You talk about this age of radicalism, Islamist extremism, the far right and the far left, that you say is sweeping Western democracies and is a civilizational landslide. Would you briefly describe the origins of this phenomena?
Yeah, good question, Joan, and thank you for having me, and hello to everybody. It's always a bit strange. You can't see how many people are watching you, but to me it looks like a screen in my study, but I know that it's going out very widely. So hello to everybody, and it's very nice to meet you all virtually. And thank you for inviting me to speak to you. My book's been out a little while. It's a bestseller, and you mentioned my podcast, The Brink. I heard today that it's been going for just over 4 weeks, 5-6 weeks, and it's already had more than 500,000 downloads. So it's really growing very, very fast indeed. So it's great. It's been really interesting to do that with Andrew Fox. And our best episode so far has been with Neil Ferguson, closely followed by Yossi Cohen and Yoav Gallant, Barry Weiss and others. So it's been really fun, and it's great to share some time with you. But yeah, it's not difficult to see that we're living now in an age of increasing radicalism. In my book, I describe this phenomenon of the new radicalism, which has 3 parts. It has the Islamist extremist branch, and then it has the progressive radicalism stream as well. And those two increasingly are becoming almost indistinguishable in some ways. And then it's got this third branch, which is of the nationalist chauvinists or the white supremacists or the far right, that broad collection of extremists, which doesn't trouble us as much in the UK as it does in America and elsewhere in Europe as well. And it's not difficult to see, looking around us, that these 3 groups of people are increasingly dominating the public debate, whether that's on social media or whether that's in Parliament here in Congress in America, whether it's in our education systems, in our universities, on the streets, in the mobs that come out very frequently, even after the ceasefire and so on. But really, Joan, your question is, why is it happening? Where does it come from? And I describe in my book the way in which I think the fundamental, there are lots of reasons. One, of course, is social media, but I think that the fundamental reason is that we have vacated the playing field to them by undermining and undoing our own sense of self and sense of national identity. And I trace that back to really 1945 onwards, where I suppose one way of looking at it is that I feel that then a divergence began between Israel, or the Jews that went on to found Israel, and other countries in the West. From the point of view of Israel, the nascent state, 1947-48, that the lesson of World War II was that a nation state, secure nation state, was essential. But the lesson that the rest of the West seemed to take from World War II was that a nation state was suspect, was possibly the root of fascism. And so in the name of never again, Western countries slowly embarked upon a project of undoing our patriotism, our pride in our history, in our tradition and customs and culture and language, and of course our borders, in the belief that opening those up and elevating other cultures, particularly problematically Muslim culture as it came over to Britain and elsewhere, was the way to ensure that fascism wouldn't come back, was a way to ensure that never again would be upheld. And yet the effect that it had was that it undid the very things that will act as a bulwark against radicalism. It meant that we had nothing to say about our national story, about our identity, and that the only things that we had to say were negative about ourselves. And that meant that people who were not, who did not subscribe to our old values, the radicals of the different tribes, were able to dominate and to, as we were busy being nice, they were busy taking advantage of us being nice and to hoover up a lot of the energy that previously would have gone in more healthy directions in society.
So is this what you mean then when you're talking about the centre has collapsed? Because I think people often think if we talk about the centre, we're talking purely in political terms.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'm
But
not.
you're not, are you? You're talking about values.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not. Sometimes in the advert for our podcast, we compared ourselves to Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell, the ultimate centrist dads, and Andrew and I described ourselves as the antidote to Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell. So I'm not in favour of centrist dads or any other kind of centrism in that narrow sense. But I do think that there's an argument to be made that the centre, in a cultural sense, as in who we used to be, our centre of gravity has not just collapsed, it's been caused to collapse by the elites, which I describe as centrist fundamentalists. And that term, centrist fundamentalists, really it's a form of elitist champagne socialism or social democracy. But the fundamentalist part implies that they have their sort of open borders, down with us mentality, as Sir Roger Scruton described it, as a dogma. And over the years, anybody who has had the gall to resist it or to articulate older values of patriotism or of pride or of national identity has been derided and mocked and described as fascists or Nazis by this elite class. And so there's a very fundamentalist intolerance of anybody who wishes to fly our national flag, for example, or anybody who wishes to vote for Brexit, or to insist that our history isn't purely one sin after the other, but has a few good bits in it too. They're called fascists because, again, harking back to this World War II language that believing in yourself means that you're a proto-Hitler, and guarding against that is felt by that elite class to be the right thing, the grown-up thing to do, and everybody else has to be silenced. And so it's that sort of weaponization of taboo that has accelerated the collapse of our common sense, I suppose.
So what do you identify as like the common threads? Because at first glance, people think kind of Islamist extremism and, for instance, what's seen as the left, or they would like to claim the title progressive, I'm sure, but it's not one I would give the far left and the far right. What do you think are the threads that unite them in anti-Semitism?
Well, that's a very good question. I suppose the thing that unites these three groups, the far left, the far right, and the Islamists, is a sense of being against the establishment. They all have a slightly different view of what the establishment is, but they all feel that they're reacting against the system. And I think all of them feel that the system is somehow controlled by Jews. Because they're all anti-Semites, or there's anti-Semitism threading through a lot of, those three movements. And they all come at it from different angles. The Islamists come at it from the point of view of really Hitler's rhetoric from the Second World War, which was so successfully translated into the Muslim world by Haj Amin al-Husseini, the leader of the Palestinians during the Second World War, and then into the Muslim Brotherhood, and from there into the various different strands of jihad, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, even the Iranian regime, and has sort of filtered through many Muslim societies in that way. So the anti-Semitism that Muslims have, or many Muslims have, is really inspired by Nazism, I think. Whereas the far left it's inspired more by communism, by Stalin, by the anti-Israel propaganda, which what they were called Zionologists, created in the Kremlin during the Cold War, and was then very actively pushed out into the West and elsewhere, into Africa and elsewhere, with a massive propaganda campaign, disinformation, via political channels, via pamphleteering, via stooge newsletters and newspapers in the UK and America and elsewhere, and all other on university campuses and radio broadcasts and so on. So I think it's inspired by that, which is bound up with decolonization and all that sort of stuff. And I think the far right, again, perhaps comes originally from Nazism. In America, that has a big problem with Nazism. America had sort of Nazi flirtations from the get-go. In Mein Kampf, Hitler actually praises America for its attitude towards race. And during the Second World War, there was a big Nazi, or not big, but a significant Nazi movement in America. And you have Nazis to this day. One of probably the biggest far-right website is called the Daily Stormer, obviously modeled on Der Stürmer, the Julius Streicher, a Nazi newspaper. So I think that again, the far right probably inspired more by Nazism, but all three of them see the Jews as the establishment, the Jews as the sinister force of power behind their marginalization, and they wish to assert their own societies in defiance of the Jews, whether it's a far left utopia, whether it's a far right chauvinist, white supremacist sort of Aryan state, or whether it's a Muslim nation under Sharia law.
You argue that there's nothing inherent to Islam that condemns its followers to hate the Jews and their homeland, and that what we've got to do is embrace those Muslims who have in turn embraced our way of life, while adopting a profound intolerance of those who foment hatred, divisiveness, radicalism, and violence. I suppose what I was going to, you say that you suggest that Israel offers a potential model for how Muslim integration into a democracy is possible. I think a lot of people's faith in that has been rattled, and they find it very difficult to separate out Islamists from the Muslim community. It's crucially important in the UK. It's our biggest ethnic minority. So we're going to have to take a stronger approach in terms of integration, which I think we've been sadly let down with by governments over many years. They just have not addressed integration or even understood, I think, what it is. What lessons do you think we can learn from the Jewish state on this?
Well, I'm glad you picked that point up, because it's probably the most unexpected or dangerous of my arguments in a certain way, because people on my side of the argument tend to be trying to wake people up to the dangers of Islam and the dangers of Muslims as a fifth column in our society, and all the radicalism that we saw, in Birmingham with the Aston Villa game just the other day, or any other number of examples. And it's the argument that I make, which is more positive towards Islam, is usually the province of the left rather than of the right. And I'm not often described as being on the left.
No.
And so, but I think that my perspective on Islam really is informed by my experience of Israel, and how in Israel there are Muslims who not only have assimilated, or assimilate, as it were, to use our terminology, into Israel, but also are very patriotic. There are Muslims there who fight in the IDF. There are Muslims there who are very successful, who run banks, or who present TV programs, or who play for Israel in the national football team. And I do feel that, although I don't want to downplay the scale of the problem, either in Israel or here, uh, I think it just feels to me, it sticks in my throat it feels like a betrayal of those people to describe all Muslims as being a threat, I guess. You know, I mean, after October the 7th, one of the few glimmers of light in those dark days was how so many Israeli Muslims were so impressive. There were Muslims who were killed on October the 7th, of course, by Hamas, but also risked their lives to save Jews.
Is anybody else having trouble? You keep freezing.
Oh, do I?
Jake, I don't know if it's... No, please continue.
Okay. Yeah, there were Muslims who risked their lives to defend and protect Jews on October the 7th. There was one story of a guy, Muslim guy, I forget his name now, I believe it's in the book, he ran a bicycle shop, and he donated some bicycles to some Jewish kids who were evacuated from the kibbutzim. And in return, his shop was firebombed by Islamist extremists, and then there was a crowdfunding campaign to rebuild it. There was an example of Lucia Harish, the famous Israeli Muslim TV anchor, who gave a very moving and patriotic statement to camera, believing in Israel directly after October the 7th, and even on October the 7th itself, oversaw some rescue moves that saved some lives from the fire zone in the south. There was even Mansour Abbas, the ostensibly Islamist leader of the Ram party in Israel, was very statesmanlike, and when one of his MKs suggested that some of the footage on October the 7th was fake, he immediately sacked her with much stronger response than you would have seen from the Labour Party in Britain, perhaps. And so there are lots of examples of those people, and I feel like those things mean a lot to me personally, and it's a challenge and a rebuke in trying to formulate a position on British Muslims and Muslims elsewhere. It prevents us from falling into the extreme of tarring them all with the same brush, I suppose. And I think that also, as a Jew, I mean, my mother is Orthodox, my sister is Orthodox, both of them cover their hair. I feel a bit less allergic to the idea of religious observance within a democracy than maybe some people who aren't in touch with religion. I remember one anecdote I've got in my book is where I was in the Old City during the stabbing intifada, if you remember that, receiving a briefing from Mickey Rosenfeld, the chief of Jerusalem police. And I was with a colleague from a left-wing paper. I was working for the Mail at the time, I think, and a colleague from a left-wing paper was with me. And when we had this briefing, Mickey Rosenfeld was telling us about the things they looked out for as Muslims streamed past into the Old City to identify terrorists. And at that point, a Muslim man walked past wearing full robes, and my colleague from the left-wing paper said, "Aren't you going to pull him aside? Presumably he will be a suspect." And Mickey looked genuinely baffled and said, "Why? He's just wearing Muslim clothes." And of course many Gulf Arabs wear those robes and other things. So and they're not hostile to the West. In fact, they're stronger on the Muslim Brotherhood than we are. So I feel so that feels to me like an example of when people aren't sort of involved with religion and with Muslims, they can sometimes formulate, even from the left, a more stereotypical view than is actually accurate. At the same time, we cannot underestimate the scale of the problem. It's a huge radicalism in our communities in Britain, in Europe, and elsewhere around the world is a vast problem that we may not be able to solve. It might be indelible. It might be insurmountable. You know, Trevor Phillips, I mentioned in my book, called it the hardest task we've ever faced as a society. It's a task that we haven't even begun to think about a strategy to deal with it, let alone come to grips with it. It's a huge problem because of the embeddedness of the Muslim Brotherhood, partly in our culture. So I don't want to downplay it for a moment. I don't want to, for a moment, give the sense that I'm in any way soft or ignorant or willfully blind to this scale of the problem. But I just feel like either you have a fascist policy where you deport every single Muslim in Britain, or you find a way to hit the extremists hard, make the community work by banning extremist groups and finding a way to integrate those Muslims who are willing to integrate into our way of life more tightly. I can't see there's any other way forward than that.
Interesting, because it brings me, can I just remind people, if they want to ask a question, please put your questions in the chat. Now, John Mirish, who's a Beverly Hills city councillor, he has put a question in that relates exactly to this. He said, British politicians like Zara Sultana, Adnan Hussein, Humza Yousaf keep company with crazed Jew hunters like David Miller and Suleiman Ahmed. Your party, he says, I don't think it is your party, Jake, because they're Labour, well, they're independents and former Labour, seems to be built upon a combination of populism and anti-Semitism. How can the UK sideline these populist Jew haters? And I think that's a really good question. It also speaks to something I think that was said, I don't know if it was on one of your podcasts, that the big conundrum for Western governments is how can we ban the Muslim Brotherhood and at the same time retain our freedoms? Arab countries themselves don't wrestle with this problem.
Yeah. I think probably by your party, he meant the your party as in capital Y, capital P, the Zara Sultana Corbyn thing, rather than my party.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, your party, of course. Oh my God. Yeah, Jeremy Corbyn is how I think of it, but yes.
Yeah, just to clarify that point. But yeah, I think, I mean, this really gets to the heart of the problem, the absolute heart of the problem. You know, in his 1945 book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, Karl Popper famously wrote that if we tolerate wrote about how it's important not to tolerate the intolerant. He wrote about how if we extend unlimited tolerance to the intolerant, then the tolerant will be done away with and tolerance with them. And that's what we face today. The problem is, you know, our democratic norms rest upon a society in which the majority is of one culture and plays by the same rules and shares the same values. The principle of consent is vital to our democracy. It's what it works upon. Unfortunately, what we've seen since 1997 until today is a policy of immigration that has been so rapid and has welcomed people in such numbers and at such speed that we now see societies within societies, countries within countries almost, that don't share a proper allegiance to our own values and way of life, but they have their true allegiances are more tribal or more to their own homeland, and there's a kind of hybrid of where they have allegiance to Britain, but it's their Islamized version of Britain, which they seek to impose on the rest of us. And we saw that with a press conference with some of the Islamist MPs the other day and Jeremy Corbyn, where you had on the wall behind them alternating Union flags and Palestinian flags. And so really the challenge for us now is that the old democratic assumptions, or the assumptions that underpinned our democracy, have been fragmented. And so you see people with very different values and a very different agenda using our democratic process to achieve democratic power in parliament and representation, but they don't seek to use it for the good and welfare of all citizens. They seek to use it to advance a sectarian agenda that's mainly based around Gaza, but ultimately is based around enforcing an Islamist way of life upon the rest of us. I mean, that is the Muslim Brotherhood agenda that it's seeking to advance.
So they use our own democratic values against us.
Exactly. And so the challenge is, sorry to get to the point, yeah, the challenge is that we need to find a way of defending our system of democracy against this new community in our country that seeks to use it in a hostile way. And that's a huge challenge. How to do that while retaining our democratic credibility requires new measures, probably new legislation, perhaps tweaks to the system, but it begins with somebody recognizing the problem and being determined to do something about it. At the moment, our political classes aside perhaps from reform, maybe the Tories, but most of our politicians don't recognise the problem and have no motivation to begin to come to grips with it.
There's been suggestion, Jake, that we should change our language, that anti-Semitism is an 18th century word that's got no more real meaning to its intent. Jew hatred is apparently what it means. Islamophobia was created by Islamists to quieten any criticism of Islam. I don't know if that's true, but it should be Muslim hatred, which is different from criticising Islam.
Yeah.
What would you say to that?
So when you said that it suggested we should change
I
our
think
language,
it's just saying that we shouldn't be talking about Islamism. It's it should be Muslim hatred of Jews.
Yeah. I mean, I was going to say that when you started that question, you said it's been suggested we should
I'm
change
not
our
sure
language.
about that, because how would we move to any kind of separating ordinary Muslims who have integrated from Islamists?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, when you suggested that we should change our language, I thought at first you were going to say to Arabic. So I was quite thankful that you didn't say that. But yeah, I mean, all this, the sort of the tinkering with language, I think, is a bit of a distraction most of the time, particularly when it comes to whether we call it anti-Semitism or Jew hatred. I mean, I'm slightly hypocritical because my previous book was called Israelophobia, which proposed a new word. But nonetheless, setting that aside, I think that the case of Islamophobia, though, is different, because that's not really about the term. It's about the legislation that would go with that term. It's about the criminalization of that. So it's not the word itself. It's about creating a new category of crime, which would be to criticize Muslims or anything that seems to be Muslim. And the problem with that is it in effect could act as a blasphemy law, meaning that we would be unable to criticize extremist forms of Islam and anything to do with Islam, allowing the Muslim Brotherhood and like-minded people to advance their agenda using the law against us. So that's the real danger of that. It's the legal machinations rather than the word itself, I think.
Yeah. Oh. So, can I don't disagree. Can I just call upon, we have a little break for a moment, don't go anywhere, because I want to ask Sari Steinberg, who's one of our regional directors. She wants to intervene here and say a few words on behalf of ELNET and to our audience. Sari.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Joan, and thank you, Jake. I combined your names there for a minute. Thank you for sharing your tremendous insights, Jake. I look forward to hearing more during the Q&A. The dynamic between Israel and Western powers is complex, and while there's a great deal of anti-Semitism in the form of anti-Israel fervor, there's also a tremendous level of respect for Israel. As one of our staunchest supporters has said, they don't have to love us, they just have to respect us. And so this week, there's an international seminar on operational lessons from Israel's seven-front war, convening senior commanders and officials from the militaries of the US, Canada, the UK, Germany, Finland, India, Greece, Cyprus, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, Austria, Estonia, Japan, Morocco, Romania, Serbia, and Slovakia. That's a lot of countries that want to learn from Israel. The purpose of the seminar is to strengthen our cooperation, enhance familiarity with diverse operational approaches, exchange professional knowledge and experience among the participating militaries, and reinforce understanding of the IDF's activity. Today, also, ELNET Italy partnered with other organizations to launch the forum on the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor called IMEC, known as IMEC, a key step in shaping a new global landscape built on shared interests and opportunity. Speaking to Jake's point about radical Islamists versus non-radical Muslims, as many of you know, we've brought delegations to Israel, not only of MPs from Europe, but also of imams. And we've brought together leaders of Israel, Europe, and Muslim states that are members of, and perhaps potential members of, the Abraham Accords. They're talking to each other, and we're facilitating it. We're planning for 2026. So far, we have 24 planned delegations, 5 strategic dialogues, and 3 conferences. And in the meantime, we have to complete the 2025 budget and programs, and we need your support for this. Our work is urgently needed, as Joan said. We're growing in size and in impact, and you are the key. Please stretch yourselves as you determine your end of year giving and consider doubling your investment in ELNET. Our costs are up, the dollar is down, and I can assure you that your return on investment will be unparalleled. Please reach out to us with any questions about our work, our impact, or your tax-deductible contribution. Randy is providing a link in the chat, or you're welcome to email info@felnetus, that's F like Frank, ELNETUS.org, so that we can provide you with more information. Thank you. And now we'll return to questions from participants. Back to you, Joan and Jake.
Thank you, sorry, thank you. Sorry, so please put your questions to Jake in the chat. Jake, let's just say a word, or perhaps you can say a word. The 2019 election, it showed, you know, Corbynism was an electoral non-starter. In fact, it was at one moment when I felt very proud of the British voters who so thoroughly rejected his politics. And I don't believe it was just about Brexit. I do think they found those hard left politics very distasteful, and everything that went with them. You also believe that the youth quake, though, that he energised, has taken on a life of its own since October the 7th. It's gone into overdrive, would you say? I mean, how and why has the Palestinian cause come to dominate the progressive movement since 2023, to at times the exclusion of all else, followed by our mass media and social media?
Good question. I mean, I think that one dangerous move in our politics is that if you look back to 2019, it feels like an age ago in so many ways. And one of the ways is that the two-party system still was up and running and worked properly. You had Labour and the Conservatives. It was going to be one or the other, and they both divided the vote share almost equally, with a bit left over for the Liberal Democrats, who took a hammering that election. Whereas these days, we're looking at the fragmentation of the two main parties, with the Tories leeching almost all of their support so far to reform, and which is a totally untested party, a new party, and Labour leaking support to a range of other options from your party, not yours personally, Joan, but your party, to the Greens are doing very well as well, not to mention the Liberal Democrats, and then you've got the Gaza Independents, the few who haven't joined your party, and so on. So that's made politics a lot more volatile. But I think that in terms of the youth, why the Palestinian cause has come to dominate, this is something that I actually spoke in some detail to Sir Neil Ferguson about in my podcast and my book. So the way that the two work is that I sometimes quote some of the interviews in my podcast in the book, if you see what I mean. So you can hear the whole thing on the podcast if that's not too confusing. But Sir Neil was talking about this in some detail, about how the Palestinian cause has done it. And I think that there are various different ways of looking at it. One is that the hard left, through the principle of intersectionality, what that really translates to is that they all pledge allegiance to a suite of causes, whether or not it affects them directly or not. So transgender activists will support green agendas or Palestine agendas or whatever, race agenda, colonialism agenda, and you're expected to give solidarity to whatever movement and cause is presented to you in your group. But there was still a sense that in order to get critical mass, to really make an impact, they had to all rally behind one thing. And first it was the environment. They tried it. It didn't really work that well. As Sir Neil told me, it ended up just being a whole load of people throwing soup over paintings. Doesn't really do it. But then in 2020, they almost got there with Black Lives Matter. That was a worldwide movement that was very, very successful, but it did lose momentum after a year or so, partly because it required a lot of work on behalf of white people, in that you're assuming guilt on your own head. And so you had to declare, shout your, what do you call it? They call it shout your racism or whatever it was. You had to admit that you were part of the problem, which is not entirely comfortable. So you had a movement that was asking you to hate yourself as well as hate the establishment. Whereas when the Gaza war came along, suddenly you had a new cause that would allow you to externalize all of your guilt to another group, to the Jews. They are the reason for all the injustices in the world, all the suffering in the world. They are the baby killers. They are the genociders. They are the apartheid state white supremacists. And suddenly you were able to absolve yourself of that guilt and rally behind this cause. In addition, this was a cause that was already embedded via Muslim Brotherhood funds and preparation throughout our campuses and throughout the West. I mean, if you think about the speed with which, another point that Sunil made, the speed with which these protests began on October the 7th, they were so professional and they were so fast. That just speaks to the amount of preparation they had done into the infrastructure in the West, Islamist infrastructure in the West. So, and they'd already been, the Muslim Brotherhood had been courting the left and beginning to work with them over decades. So there was that infrastructure and funding as well. And of course, then you had the social media campaign, partly driven by Russia, by China, by Iran, that was hugely aggressive towards Israel, and the mainstream media propaganda and the propaganda from the UN and others, all coming together to amplify this cause and give it rocket boosters. So the hard left, who took this cause in replacement for Black Lives Matter, were buoyed by this huge tide of propaganda coming from all quarters. I think that really accounts largely for the way in which it's been so successful and has swept up so many. The youthquake of Corbyn's 2019 has really taken on a new life since 2023.
It has been shocking the way the mainstream media has kind of eaten up anything that Hamas has released. Of course, often with the legitimized by the UN and put it out on our on like the BBC, which is one of the if not the most watched broadcaster in the world. It has had a very significant impact, I think. And indeed, the issue that BBC is facing at the moment about what it did to President Trump's speech, and alongside that, they've also been called out on their bias about the Gaza-Israel war, about Israel. So yeah, little steps perhaps, but it wasn't called out an awful lot sooner. Can I give the floor briefly to Larry Hochberg? Jake, Larry is one of the founders of ELNET, and he is Chair Emeritus. Larry, do you want to? You're on mute, Larry.
Okay, so first of all, it's a very intellectual, complete presentation, which is really, I think, interesting for all of our participants, which are numerous today. You should know that we have a lot of people on this call, both sides of the Atlantic. A couple of questions. The silent majority has always played a role in these kinds of things after a period of time. One, what is your estimate of the silent majority's influence, and will it come into play in Great Britain, which is a very important place? Second, how do you feel the large birth rate of the Muslim population bodes for things going forward? ELNET is positively oriented and therefore has reached out to moderate Muslims and leaders of moderate Muslims organizations, particularly in France and Belgium, with some success. But we need to know what to do for our piece of this going forward. And I think you're in a good position to try and steer us a little in that direction, because we cannot lose Great Britain. It just can't do it. So what do you think about all that?
So the birth rate was the second question. What was the first question again? Sorry, my memory is like a goldfish.
The role of the silent majority, which has always
Oh,
been
yes.
critical in democracies after a period of time,
Yeah,
and there's no better democracy than Great Britain, and yet does the silent majority care? Is it active? Is Israel and Jews enough for it to stimulate them, or this destruction of the system you have there by the left and the Muslim aggressive Muslims? What does all that mean in your country?
Well, I think the silent majority in Britain exists. It's very silent, and the problem is that it's been subverted and undermined and demoralized over so many years by this culture of centrist fundamentalism. We're being hacked by the Chinese, so I think that there's I'll give you two little ways of illustrating this. The other day, there was a couple of years ago, there was a horrible murder of a young Muslim girl called Sarah Sharif by her parents, her mother, who burned her, beat her to death. And it emerged last week that a neighbor saw some evidence of this abuse and was worried about it, disturbed by it, but didn't dare raise the alarm because they feared they were going to be called Islamophobic or racist. Another example is that the 2017 bombing of the Manchester Arena that was undertaken by Salman Abedi, a British Libyan young man with a backpack. In the inquest a couple of years ago, a security guard by the name of Kyle Lawler testified that he had seen Salman Abedi walking into the Manchester Arena with his heavy backpack and had thought that something felt wrong about it, but then said to himself, no, you're just being Islamophobic. You're just stereotyping a Muslim with a backpack. Don't do anything about it. And as a result, Salman Abedi went into the Manchester Arena, set his bomb off, and killed 22 children and their parents and friends. And these are just two examples of the way in which people's instincts have been dulled because we've been taught that we are racist from the beginning. We've been taught we're a racist society. We've been taught to be ashamed of our history, of our values, of our identity. And this means that the silent majority has begun to lose its sense of moral compass and its ability to stand up and articulate things that you or I would be able to see and call and name without hesitation. And this is a big problem. And in my book at the end, I talk about the science of social change, because what we do need is a social cascade, a wholesale change in our society. Like, for example, in the United States, when public opinion turned from segregation to abandoning segregation, or from slavery to abandoning slavery, or any other form of social change. In World War II, when society, after World War II, society gradually turned against Nazism over time. We need to have that kind of social cascade in Britain, a restoration of our values. And in order for that to happen, people need to begin breaking their silence. The silent majority need to be able to find their voice and to begin to convince other people of their views, to begin to air sensible, old values. And then other people who see that it's okay to speak will begin to follow in their wake. And if combined with political change, there is a hope that some kind of cascade can be affected. But these things are difficult to predict and even more difficult to engineer. But I do think that that's nothing less will do than a wholesale social change. And the silent majority, you're absolutely right, needs to be at the heart of this. And the demographic point is a very good one. I mean, Muslims have accounted for a large part of the population growth over the last 20 years or so. Their birth rate far outstrips the birth rate of the mainstream. And it's obvious where that's all going to go, which makes it even more urgent to try to convert Muslims, not from their religion, but to our values en masse. If that can't be done, then the future of Britain is quite dark.
Thank you.
That's a complete analysis. Thank you very much.
Most polling and focus group work shows that the kind of silent majority are not interested at all in what's going on in
Yeah.
in the Middle East, and
Well,
more bothered
yeah.
about prices and their living conditions and jobs and normal things.
But yeah, I mean that's right. But I think that we are seeing a lot of anger towards the establishment in Britain
Yeah,
and across the West, and that anger is not just a radical anger. There's also an anger from ordinary people. In Britain, we've seen it very much with ordinary communities who've had potentially dangerous illegal immigrants housed in their communities, in hotels and so on, who have a big track record of committing sexual offences and murder and other crimes, theft and so on. And those people are beginning to rise up against those decisions, rise up against the political elites, and they've had enough. They don't want it anymore. And I think that at the end of my book, I talk about some, again, in this section on the science of social change, that there's a certain sort of psychology that goes on when you are in a society where a particular view is very, very dominant and very enforced from the top down. You begin to repress your own views to the contrary. Sometimes you can feel like you're playing a game, so you know what you really think, but you don't dare say it, and so you pretend like you don't think it. Or you can convince yourself that actually you never thought it in the first place, or that or that you don't think it at all. I mean, can I finish this, or do you want to jump in another question?
Well, it's just that we might call that telling lies, might we? Because Zora Mizrahi says, what's your thoughts on how to combat an ideology deeply rooted in taqiyya or justifiable lies and take the argument to the heart of the followers and apologists in the West?
Well, I mean, another person I interviewed for the book and for the podcast was Ed Hussein, the former Islamist who has written books about it, including one called The Islamist, another one called Among the Mosques. And it was interesting to me that he was a member of Hizb ut-Tahrir as a young man. And what converted him out of that radicalism and extremism wasn't his encounters with people like you or me, with Western mainstream people. It was conversations with his father, who was a Muslim, is an observant Muslim, but from a more conservative and Sufi tradition that rejected radicalism in the same way as the Emiratis do, for example. And so he was led out of extremism by his own side. I think this is really vital to try to create those mechanisms or help those mechanisms to develop with partners like the UAE and others, to enable Muslim communities to de-radicalize themselves. And I hope that if the Saudis were to join the Abraham Accords, that could help with de-radicalizing communities around the world, because it might lend a top-down measure to efforts to de-radicalize people from the grassroots up.
Yeah, for sure. We've got a question from Victor Abrams, who's actually on the UK board of ELNET UK. Do you think that anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism is getting more intense since the ceasefire? Now anti-Semites are going back to Jewish supremacy attacks and apartheid and genocide approaches rather than focusing on Gaza.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's more intense. I just think the mask is less convincing. You know, during the war lent itself to the mask of I'm not against Jews, I'm just against the fact they love killing children type reasoning. But now that there's the ceasefire, these people are exposed, and the thing is that they don't actually care that they've been exposed. They almost treat the excuses with a sort of contempt. They don't. They throw around words like Zionists as cover with such casual abandon. They know that we don't buy it. They don't buy it either. But they just feel so emboldened after 2 years of activism that hasn't been restrained in any way, that they feel that they're riding high and they have the wind in their sails.
Oh, sorry, Jackie. I'm just reading this. A question from Marika Saboros, a journalist. What, in your view, is the most appropriate response to yet another UN rapporteur, Reem Al-Sass, who last week indulged publicly in denialism of atrocities on October the 7th, in particular the mass rape and other sexual violence. That's despite a UN report by Pramila Patten, the UN's own special representative of the Secretary General on sexual violence in conflict, confirming extensive evidence of systematic sexual violence as a deliberate strategy by Hamas on the day.
Well, I think that with regard to the UN, it's a bit like the BBC. You've got organizations that have deep, deep roots in anti-Semitism in different ways, and they have deep systemic problems running through all the different arms and sections of those organizations in different ways and to different intensities, but it's always there. And the UN is worse than the BBC because it's due to its vulnerability to Soviet propaganda during the Cold War. It's been that way. It's been the battlefield of an anti-Zionist campaign for many, many decades. I need not remind you of the 1975 motion "Zionism is Racism," which was passed and only repealed with the fall of communism in 1991. So with these organizations, pressure to reform them is one thing, but what they really need is a baseball bat being taken to them. And Trump is taking a baseball bat to the BBC right now. And I, for one, am pretty happy about that. As I wrote it in a column this week, of course, I love the BBC. I've worked for the BBC. My heart breaks for the BBC, but my heart broke for the BBC a long time ago when it began to be dominated by ideology. It doesn't break for it now when someone's seeking to do something about it with force. So it needs some bold leadership, whether from President Trump or somebody else, a concerted effort by countries united behind Western values, which we don't have right now, but which may emerge in the next decade, to stand on our values and insist upon them and take a baseball bat to these organizations, not just tweaking around the edges, but actually destroying some of the foundations of this malevolency which is coursing through their veins. So it needs that kind of robust, determined action, I think.
Yes, you do mean a metaphorical baseball bat.
I'm not sure I'm advising Trump turning up with an actual baseball bat in New York.
No.
I'm not sure he'd have much luck. Yeah.
Indeed. I think this might be our final question. Again, it's from John Mirish. Is the silent majority's unwillingness to speak out something that opens the field to the Tommy Robinsons of the UK?
Yeah, I think so in a way. I mean, Tommy Robinson is an interesting case because he's viewed from the other side of the Atlantic, from America, by Elon Musk and others as a good thing. To most mainstream people in Britain, there's a lot of anxiety surrounding him because of his history of involvement with the fascist British National Party. He's written an essay which has some rather spicy things about Jews and about the Great Replacement theory, which of course is a far-right trope. And yet he's very strongly pro-Israel as well. And a lot of Jews say, look, we need to take every friend that we can get right now. I'm of the view that he is not a good thing. And I feel like, I just feel a sense of regret that he's the best we've got. And again, I think he has risen out of a sort of funhouse mirror of our old heroes and our old public figures, because they are no longer to be found. Our political classes are, on the whole, pathetic and uninspiring, with one or two exceptions, but on the whole. Our community leadership and the leadership in civil society are flaccid and pathetic and demoralized. We're run by bureaucrats, by red tape, by health and safety, by petty equivocation about the sorts of language that we use. Our police are arresting 30 people a day for social media posts. In this sort of context, the person who raises his voice with most aggression in the street is Tommy Robinson, and that's who a lot of ordinary good people are following because they feel he's their tribune. And it's a shame that he's the only person they seem to have.
Jake, can I thank you? I'm going to hand over now to Larry Hochberg, who you heard from before, founder and chair emeritus. But can I just personally say thank you so much. Thank you for the book. And I hope people get the book and read the book, because I think it's really worth going through. And I'm sure people know that from listening.